All right, we've hit 30. I think that's a good number, right?
Okay.
Let's roll. Okay, so I'm Eve Kahn. I'm the co-head of the lectures committee for the Victorian Society's New York chapter, and I'm thrilled to be introducing tonight's fascinating speaker. And I also wanted to make sure that I say publicly that I am incredibly grateful for all the other Victorian Society in New York board members' commitment to this organization in upside down times, to scholarship and preservation advocacy. A few quick housekeeping items. I'm going to be muting people during the talk and then unmuting people. We prefer if you put your questions into the chat, but if you feel compelled to pipe up, that's okay too. Really looking forward to a lively Q&A session about this ever more relevant topic. Just really quickly, October 12th, we have a talk coming up on a completely underappreciated 19th century New York ceramics innovator named James Carr. October 28th, we have two contemporary artists who riff imaginatively on Victorian precedents. November 11th, there's a new book about Civil War nurses. November 16th, we have two books that we're going to be celebrating on the slave trade in New York. And December 9th, we are celebrating the new biography of Eliza Greatorex. She was a great 19th century painter and engraver, and she was the second woman allowed to join the National Academy of Design. So tonight's speaker, Professor Vincent DiGirolamo, and he carefully wrote it out for me phonetically. So his family members are here, and I hope I got that right. He is the author of this page turner of a new book, which I have now read twice. Love it. He's an associate professor at Baruch College's history department, specializing in 19th and 20th century American social history, focusing on workers, children, immigrants, city life, and print culture. He's a former journalist and documentary filmmaker whose credits include the award-winning documentary Monterey Boat People about Vietnamese refugee fishermen in his hometown of Monterey, California. He earned his undergrad and master's degree respectively from UC Berkeley, UC Santa Cruz, his PhD from Princeton. Crying the News, A History of America's Newsboys, fresh out from Oxford University Press, has received prizes from groups including the Organization of American Historians and Cornell's Industrial and Labor Relations School. It is magisterial, insightful, at times heart-wrenching, and a highly recommended look at how real news and outlandish hoaxes were disseminated on the streets by vulnerable small children. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor DiGirolamo.
Oh, thank you.
It's an honor to be introducing this book.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eve. That's wonderful. I'm really grateful to be here and to address the members of the society and friends from near and far. And especially since our first planned book talk at the beautiful Rizzoli bookstore fell through because of COVID. Which, 6 months later, we're still in the thick of it, at least here in the United States. But we're adapting with masks and gloves and Zoom. So thank you all for logging on and agreeing to spend the next hour talking about this book. I will presume that most of you haven't read it. It's I know it's a little daunting at 712 pages, but my friends tell me it reads like 500. So that's my compliment. And there are a lot of pictures as well, 178 pictures, in fact, which I hope keep the pages turning as well. So let me share my screen and talk a little bit about the art. Okay. So my argument for including so many pictures was that they weren't mere illustrations or decorations, but important primary sources, right, in their own right. There are documents from the period that not only show us, in many cases, what these children look like and how their appearance changed over time due to fluctuations in fashion and the economy, which were important, but also due to just new ways of seeing, of perceiving them, and new ways of representing city life through the successive emergence of genre painting, illustrated newspapers, juvenile novels, photographs, comics, cartoons, advertisements, and later movies. So I try to deal with all of these different forms and the way in which they represent these children. And I try to show how these visual artists were not just trying to document what they saw, but they were advancing all kinds of essentially political arguments, either about the nature of childhood and the best ways of child rearing, sometimes about poverty, the causes of poverty and the best means for reform. So these are kind of the arguments that are going on visually in these images, sometimes about the corrupting influences of cities or their capacity to elevate people. And the same with the capitalism. The exploitative nature of capitalism is stressed in many of these images, or its potential for uplift. And just to pursue that latter theme, I want to focus on that the cover, the painting on the cover of the book. Let's see. So I will advance right here. So here it is. So here we have. You can see that's James Cafferty's documentary painting, Panic of 1857, Wall Street, 2:30, October 13th, 1857. So he completed it the following year with the help of assistant Charles Rosenberg, and this now hangs in this Museum of the City of New York. So here in this picture, we see the newsboys cast as capitalist heroes, right? The artist placed these two cherubic news merchants at the center of the painting, which depicts the day that all of the city's 58 banks closed and suspended specie payment. And the street with Trinity Church there looming in the background becomes choked with traders, most of whom would be recognizable to contemporaries. That man in the middle with the light drover's coat, that's a Jacob Little. He had a lot to do with causing the panic. Cornelius Vanderbilt is the little short man with the umbrella on the far right. And then we have the dark figure on the left is the New York Herald editor Hudson, and next to him is Cafferty himself. And so these pudgy, prosperous little newsboys are the only ones actively engaged in business, thus serving as symbols of hope and recovery. So I was interested in using what I call a bifocal approach, right, to work as a social historian, look at the lived experiences of these children, who were they, how many, what were their lives like, and then also to look at act as a cultural historian, trying to examine the various meanings attributed to their work, whether it's public service or whether it's a kind of a social evil. We see these two interpretations throughout the 19th century. So my aim was not simply to distinguish history from myth, but to try to explore that dialectical relationship between the two, right? To just dissect how newsboys' dual careers as workers and as symbols sort of help shape each other, creating wealth for some, mainly newspaper publishers, and then meaning for many, for the rest of us. So in order to do that, I needed a chronological approach. So this is how the book is laid out. We have these three sections: Children of the Penny, right up through the Civil War, Children of the Breach, the Gilded Age, 1866 to 1899. The picture there is the 1877 National Railroad Strike. And then the picture by Lewis Hine on the far right, Children of the State, 1900 to 1940. So I'm going to just talk about maybe the first two sections today, the Victorian age, the Victorian era period that I cover. The other thing just about method, I have this treble clef here. And my trumpet playing daughter helped me with this in trying to figure out the method and how to tell this story. I really relied on this sort of every good boy does find kind of a schema, where I wanted to look at the five kind of relationships these children had across time. The relationship with each other, right, with their families, with the industry, then with the nation at large, with the Depression and war and what's going on at large. And then finally, the relationship that they had with the cultural producers, with the image makers, and how they were represented in these various periods. So I try to ask these questions and chart those relationships over time. So let me go forward, not backwards. And David Gilmore Blythe is the artist on the painting on the left, which is one of the rare kind of unheroic depictions of these boys. So why newsboys? Why devote years of research to these picturesque little child laborers, especially since they're so idealized and romanticized? Here's a picture of Benjamin Franklin peddling his brother's newspaper, the New England Current, through the cobbled streets of Boston. Of course, he became rich and famous with his writing, Poor Richard's Almanac and The Way to Wealth, which had these, it tells you the way to wealth, right? The honesty, industry, frugality. And so he becomes sort of the moral exemplar for newsboys. And this cult of Franklin really increases in the 19th and even the 20th century, as indicated by the date of this image, which was reproduced widely. So this is the part of the idealization of the newsboy as an occupational group. Come to find out in my research that Benjamin Franklin was not the first newsboy, right? That honor goes to an anonymous slave who delivered the Boston Newsletter, which is the first successful paper in the colonies. And John Campbell, the publisher, was also the postmaster. And so there's a copy in the New York Historical Society, which was donated by Judge Sewell. And he says, it says, Mr. Campbell's Negro gave this to me, May 24th, 1705. So that's, a good 15 years before Franklin. So it's a minor discovery, but it just goes to show kind of how much slavery sort of permeated the society and underlays even our most cherished myths. So that's part of the idealization. And of course, most of us are familiar with the work of Horatio Alger, and his artistic equivalent would be John George Brown. They are contemporaries. So beginning with Ragged Dick or Street Life in New York in published in 1866, Alger presents these street boys as these good-hearted scamps whose character made success inevitable. So this is the stereotype. This is the myth. And then Brown, likewise, he depicted them as these rosy-cheeked ragamuffins who thrived on the street. And both Alger and Brown considered themselves realists, right? Here's Brown. He says, I want people 100 years from now to know how the children I painted looked. And of course, he used caps and scarves and other items from his dress-up box in the studio to convey their authenticity. And he was asked at one point, he says, how come they have these dirty clothes and these clean faces? And he says, well, if I paint them with dirty faces, you can't sell the picture. So they're realists. They're giving us good looks, but they're also sort of pledged to have a very positive view of these street kids. And finally, just to continue this theme into the late 19th and early 20th century, we have these magazines. Success Magazine, 1899, with Thomas Edison and other former newsboys. Ambition as well. So this newsboy, really society's poorest, impoverished child. In some ways, you can make a strong argument, which they started to do in the progressive era, that they were the victims of capitalism, but they become emblems of capitalism. And of course, the newspaper industry gets involved in this as well. Here is a picture of a little-known figure, Noodles Fagin. I consider him the first motivational speaker in corporate America. He was a former newsboy who had these skyscraper lungs and could really shout. And he was he was a vaudeville performer as well. And so he made a good living going around newspapers, giving pep talks to these newsboys, giving them lessons in salesmanship. So he wanted, you can sell papers with a clean face as well as a dirty face. He had all kinds of little mottos. So again, this success stereotype in preaching is part of the industry as well. So why devote myself to this stereotypical figure? And I have personal reasons and sort of intellectual reasons. But just to begin with a personal reason, this is a photograph of my father George on the right and my uncle Andrew there on the left, and their friend Vincent Serafino. And this is them running away from home in 1931, running away from Boston. Their father was a fisherman, had migrated to Monterey, and they wanted to go to California. So they were running away at age, what, 4, 5, they were going to California, and they got picked up. So I grew up with these stories. I grew up with this picture. And so I was always intrigued by these street children, part of the working class, part of the ethnic immigrant working class. And it turns out that with my family, they became businessmen. They opened up restaurants and card parlors and gift shops and a theater, and they were always into business. And so I was always curious about to what degree was their attitude shaped by this work. In some ways, what labor history doesn't really talk about unwaged work as much as wage work. And so I wanted to try to get into those issues through their stories. Let's see. So in terms of the intellectual reasons, professional reasons, I thought that, again, I could make a contribution to the history of labor, to the history of childhood, and the history of journalism, which I felt sort of missed important aspects of their subject. So labor history usually looks at children and child labor as kind of objects of reform, but I wanted to ask questions of them that are really reserved for adult laborers usually. How was their work organized? How did they organize themselves? How were they recruited and supervised? These sorts of questions. And then what kind of consciousness did they develop in terms of trade, craft consciousness, or a sense of themselves as belonging to a broader working class? So those are the kinds of questions I wanted to ask, as well as how important was their work to their families, and get into the family economy as part of their survival strategy. This is one of my favorite pictures that I found up in Albany at the State Archives, a Yiddish newspaper stand in New York City around 1903. And I like it because it really shows how integral the newspaper industry was to the family economy. So this is a makeshift stand that's used as a playpen. The older daughter, the older sister is selling papers, and she's minding her 2 siblings. So that is part of it. The myth, of course, says they are like little Wall Street traders, they're little businessmen, but in fact, they're part of their domestic economy and their mother's efforts to make ends meet. So I wanted to liberate labor history sort of from the tyranny of adult wage labor and look at what I call, penny capitalism, what historians call that, right? The small scale enterprises that people use, working class people involve themselves in order to make ends meet. This is no antiquarian enterprise, I want to point out. Newsboys, you might argue, were the original gig workers, right? They were not paid by wages. They would contract themselves. They would buy papers and rely on selling them. So they were little independent contractors, if you will, and thus exempt from labor laws. So this sector of the economy is growing and growing, and we can learn a lot about their advantages and disadvantages of this form of unwaged work. Where else? Oh, so here we go with the history of childhood. This is a illustration from the New York World, and we see the newsboy taunting the middle-class boy. History of childhood is a growing field, but it really focuses largely on middle-class children. That's where the sources are. That's where the documents are. They kept diaries. They had books in the house. Their cradles and their clothes have survived more than working class children. And so their childhood often stands as the childhood of the typical American boy. But I wanted to focus more on these newsboys, on these working class kids, and selling papers was really the predominant form of work that working class kids engaged in. Next to agricultural work, next to farm work, more kids sold papers than did any other one kind of thing. So I thought I could tell a national story by looking at them. Also, these newsboys were really part of one of the first urban youth subcultures, right? They had their distinctive style, their slang, their way of dressing, as we see here with this painting of William Winter. This is a Civil War era painting of the newsboy. And so I thought I could get at these children's the subculture through this particular occupation. Also, I could also wanted to show or discovered and that I could show that these children were also political actors. They were engaged in the political events of their day. So whether it is the Civil War or the sectional crisis leading up to it, this picture on the right details sort of what happened to the news peddlers in Washington, D.C., who were distributing President Franklin Pierce's message on Kansas and bleeding Kansas in the 1850s, which was divided over whether it would be slave or free. He denounced the abolitionists and denounced the anti-slavery faction, and so these kids are getting the worst of it from people who do not like their message. So that's just one of the ways in which children engaged in politics during this period. They were also stump speakers for candidates up in the 1880s and 1890s. And they would, put up posters, tear down posters. They circulated Lincoln's campaign biography in 1860. So I wanted to show how these young people got their political consciousness early on. So this is my effort to contribute to the history of childhood. Where is my little clicker? So yes, and here, of course, we have to include girls. They were a minority in the occupation, but they were there up until starting in the 1850s. There are references to girls, sometimes dressed as boys, but it is a male occupation. It is tough. There's fighting, but girls are always part of it. And so I wanted to look at not just the role of girls when they appear, but also how children are learning about manhood, learning what it is to be a man, learning about sex. All of these things are going on in the streets, in the alleys, behind the newspapers. And so I'm looking at gender and sexuality as well through these children. Lastly, just in terms of journalism history, this is Park Row. This is the big newspapers. How wonderful to be affiliated with a great enterprise that builds the largest buildings in Manhattan. And so this is true of many cities in terms of their newspaper buildings. Their architecture, interesting, accommodates newsboys. They had the newsboy entrances and showers and in some cases schoolrooms. So they are part and parcel of this civic enterprise. But the press is usually examined as a major player, the fourth estate, a shaper of public opinion and influencing political affairs. But the press, the newspapers, are also a major non-smokestack industry which employs thousands and thousands of people, men, women, and children. And so I wanted to look at this aspect of journalism history. And so that was also, I felt, kind of neglected in the literature. So a couple of other sort of just aspects of the project: oral history, right? The history of noise, of sound. We're talking about the newsboys' cries. Those cries were not uncontested. Sometimes they angered pedestrians and people, but when they would cry on Sunday, they angered the churchgoers. They incurred the wrath of the Sabbatarian movement, right? The movement to keep Sunday holy, and you can't work, you can't shout. And so from the 1850s through the late 19th century, they are having tussles with police and you know, who owns the city, and the boys would say, well, you got to stop ringing your damn bells, you know. So there was all these kinds of contestations over sound. So oral history was something that I paid attention to as well. And here's another picture, life on Broadway. This is what, 1873. And here the caption says, we can almost hear the cry of the newsboy, the rush of the feet, the roar of wheels. Soldiers, policemen, women, beggars, Negroes all mingle in the whirling rush of life, too intense to last, too much in haste to stumble often. So references to the sound of the streets and the newsboys' welcome contribution to it if you're a publisher, or if you want to hear the news, but annoying contribution to it as well. So this is part of this oral history aspect. Of course, I also, being kind of thick, came to it late in terms of a lot of my children were disabled. So it's part of disability history as well. Interestingly, in that news peddling was an occupation that caused disabilities. Children falling off streetcars, jumping streetcars, falling off, all kinds of things. So there were dangers, and it was also an occupation that accommodated children with disabilities. And so we see them used, and we have the diddly dumps in the middle, the hunchback boy. We have people with lost legs, a blind boy on the bottom left. And so these people are also part of the trade. And I wanted to study and see how their lives fared and how they fared in the occupation in the street. And also to keep in mind that news peddling is a trade, is an honest business, but it also is a form of charity. You're getting tips, you're soliciting tips. And so sometimes when a father would die, his coworkers would give the boy a route, a stand, a corner. They would buy these corners. There was a whole underground real estate market in turf, in these pitches, as they say. And so this was something that disabled newsboys took advantage of. So here I wanted to call attention to the role of the history of charity, of philanthropy, and education. So come to find out that newspapers were also huge philanthropists. You exploit the children, you recruit them, you want them nearby, but you also open a cafe in your basement, so to lure them, a penny cafe, very cheap food. You treat them to banquets and holidays, outings and excursions. So this kind of phenomenon really increased and started in the 1840s and increased throughout the century. And then as the labor movement, as newsboys are organizing and striking, and as other workers are doing it as well, this becomes a real means by which to win over their loyalty. And so we see the development of newsboy bands, putting these kids in uniform, teaching them their instruments. There's a baseball card in the middle. There's a whole Newsboy League baseball. And this started in the 1880s in Detroit in the Midwest, and it goes to the East Coast. So these teams will play each other. Boxing as well. Newspapers and the circulation managers would have boxing rings in their back alleys, and this was something they needed to encourage the boys to learn. You had to defend your corner, otherwise you were good for nothing. But of course, this develops into the Golden Gloves boxing tournament, which I'm pretty sure still exists. And so this role of press philanthropy is an important aspect of the story, and really becomes a pervasive and really pioneers it for other industries, other trades. This picture on the bottom right is a schoolroom that is in the building of the, I'm forgetting the newspaper, the Grand Rapids Press. And they didn't like the child labor laws, or the mandatory school attendance laws, rather. And so they would say, well, we could have our own school, and we can dismiss them when the extras are out. We can have the schedule accommodate our printing schedule. And so this was a case where it was a public, accredited public school in the offices of the newspaper. So this is another aspect of press philanthropy. So in a sense, I think the newspapers emerge in this book as really some of the most relentless exploiters of children's labor and innovative promoters of their welfare via these schools and outings, and also newsboy clubs and courts. There's something called newsboy republics as well, where they vote on their leaders. So these are all part of the character shaping, character building efforts of these newspapers. Character building and circulation building, they go hand in hand. So let me just wind up a little bit. Here I wanted to make a point about sort of the contemporary relevance of newsboys, right? It may still seem like kind of a trivial, marginal, niche subject, given the grave concerns we're facing as a nation. We have the pandemic, a new civil rights movement over systemic racism, and mass protests in the street. But I would just suggest that a focus on newsboys, particularly in this Victorian era, can provide an interesting, valuable perspective on these issues, because they too confronted public health crises. And here we see an epidemic in cholera of 1849. Rich people could move, they couldn't. And they also, though, made money selling cholera extras with the names of people who had died. And so they were capitalizing on this misfortune as well. So they were engaged in this victims and users. So here also is a newsboy lodging house. This is a picture in the later 19th century. These lodging houses were erected by Charles Loyne Braith's, the Children's Aid Society, in order to give these homeless kids sleeping on the streets, give them a shelter, make them pay for their meals and their showers and their lodging, but to help build character. So they too were spreaders of cholera and other diseases in the 1890s, and it became a problem at the newsboy lodging houses, and it also became a problem because the local hospitals would not treat them. So they were caught up in that particular epidemic. And I think, oh yeah, well, here's an exterior shot of the newsboy lodging house. There were several in New York, and it became a phenomenon. There were dozens and dozens throughout America, these newsboy lodging houses, sponsored by the Catholic Church, sponsored by the YWCA, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. All kinds of organizations tried to cater and ameliorate the conditions faced by these children. Some were homeless, not all were homeless, but they were all in need. And so this is a designer newsboy lodging house, Calvert Vaux, who helped design the New York Central Park. And so I included this picture because it was recently they were renting a space for residents, and so I visited and got these pictures. It's too pricey to afford now, but that is also part of the story we can talk more about later. And then, of course, in the 1918, they are victims of this flu pandemic. They were given masks as well by several newspapers, and people were afraid to buy from them. They had a habit of kind of putting the coins in their teeth and spreading germs that way, which was unappreciated by the public. And so they wore these masks, and some newspapers actually shut down because of it. So just a little perspective on this pandemic. And then in terms of race relations as well, that's an aspect of my story. To learning how to be American, learning how to be a man, is learning about race and learning about racial superiority and inferiority. So I have many instances where I try to chart sort of the emerging racial consciousness of these children, and they do fight. There are race riots, but there are periods where they engage in solidarity. They raise money to bury their friends who died. They join unions together and strike together. So the story is not one of black-white race classism, competition. It's not solely one of that. And also to look at, again, this myth of the newsboy, of this hardworking, pull yourself up by your bootstraps experience. Well, where are African American children in this myth? They're absent. They're not part of it. Yet, come to find out, they are part of the trade from the get-go. And often, they're often older than white kids because they have fewer sort of other sort of economic, occupational alternatives. But they're part of the story, even if not part of the myth. So you'll see a lot other pictures and discussion of the role of African Americans in this trade. And they also had a harder time selling. I have one story of a guy named Wes Dent in Washington, D.C., and some white kid throws a rock at him and it ricochets off his head, breaks the plate glass window, and he gets arrested for breaking the plate glass window. You know, so it's just a minor story, but it's ways in which they were sort of punished and had a riskier time. And if they dared cry headlines of Jack Johnson, the boxer, winning the championship, then they would incur the wrath of the public as well. So again, race relations is a big part of the story, as well as mass street protests. And I charted this from the 1840s up to the 20th century. So this is an indignation meeting. These newsboys are upset that this paper is coming out late, is stealing news, is hurting them economically. So they take to the streets with their placards and their hats and the signs in their hats. And so this is the earliest example that I found of sort of collective action, union action, labor action on the part of newsboys there in the 1842. But they're also active in the draft riot as well. They're attacking the New York Tribune, the Republican newspapers. The news accounts have them at the front of the crowd. And so these are some illustrations from the period. Again, looking at the role. These are our heroic newsboys who have virtue and sell papers and are symbols of the free press, but they're also involved in these deadly, violent activities. And this is another one, the Great Riot of Cincinnati, 1884. So that is a real guy there, Johnny Schneider, who sets fire to the courthouse. There was a verdict that they didn't like, and so it was a riot for several days in Cincinnati, mainly German American immigrants, and it led to a whole immigrant backlash. But these children were in the forefront of that. And then finally, I'll end with this picture. This is the Seattle Newsboys Union in 1892. So they have just formed, and they've got their banner, they've got their badges, and they are also involved in collective action and labor struggles, and they're part and parcel of the labor movement. I have found not only were they sort of independent unions who sort of sprang up as they needed, but they affiliated with the American Federation of Labor, with the Knights of Labor even earlier, with the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. So they are part and parcel of this labor movement, which is not really a story that not an aspect of the myth. Although of course the movie Newsies celebrated the one big strike in 1899, but that was by no means an anomaly. That was one in a series of strikes before and after. And so my role was kind of to plug these kids back into the working class and to look at their experience of childhood, their experience as workers, as children, and as Americans. So let me end with that, and we can take questions or comments, and I will unshare my screen.
It was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. I have a million questions, and I read the book twice. Can you talk briefly, we talked about this weeks ago, how having been a newsboy shaped an adult's mindset. We had talked about it created sort of a lifelong skepticism or independence. Did you notice that in tracing some of their lives?
Well, yes, it's hard to generalize because it's a kind of work that children did, sometimes for several years, sometimes for a few months. And so those who got famous often, credited their newsboy days, and they would talk about how it taught them to hustle, it taught them the value of a dollar, and so this narrative is quite popular, and the boys themselves are upholding this story. So I do hear that as well, and you hear. The circulation managers and the newspaper industry would say every president since Lincoln had been a newsboy, and so they try to talk about the virtue that it instills. Yet in the early 1900s, the progressive era, the wardens of penitentiaries would say, 2/3 of my inmates were newsboys. So take that. So it's hard to sort of, I thought that at one point that I would be able to quantitatively find out what happened to these children, how did it affect their adult lives. And it is really a hodgepodge. Most of these children really stayed in the working class. They became more regular wage earners, and they were teamsters and drivers and barmen and porters and all kinds of jobs like that, also working in other trades. A minority did become newspaper writers, or did become businessmen, Thomas Edison, but those relatively few who did were much more prominent and outspoken. So its impact on children's adulthood is hard to sort out sort of demographically and quantitatively, but it's part of the narrative, and so that was something to find out that I had to sort of throw in the towel on finding on to say, yes, being a newsboy young results in this kind of character trait as an adult. It was just too diverse.
So when were the last ones that you would have seen on the streets of New York calling out the headlines? What years did it actually kick in?
Well, I take my story up to the 1930s. And this here it changes, because all throughout this period, it is work for children and it is work for adults. When there's money to be made, there are adults involved. So I look at this as, I call it, the tiers of the trade. And so in the Great Depression, men were unemployed, men were selling apples, men were chasing kids off the streets to sell papers. So there were still young people in the 30s, and still also in the 40s with World War II, but fewer. It becomes much more adults and newsstands, so there's fewer children. And then in the 50s as well, it's even fewer. You have suburbanization, you have competition from radio. So it becomes much more of a marginal occupation, and the carrier, the deliverer, becomes much more prominent during these periods. But it hasn't gone away. I mean, in the 80s in Oakland, California, the newspapers were recruiting kids to stand next to news boxes, another invention that they hated and destroyed. And so kids were used then. And then I also delivered papers for a week. I took over the route of my nephew a few years ago on Long Island, and it was all adults except for some kids, some families. Some people bring their kids to help them, and it is immigrant. It is many languages spoken. People with their cars. So we look at how we get our newspapers today. It is not the child labor, not the street hawker, but it is still the newcomers in society and the poor people who are not working for wages. They don't have health insurance. They're fined if they somebody complains. And so in some ways the trade still has some of those, resembles some of its old traits.
We have two audience members who want to know more about Noodles Fagin.
Noodles Fagin.
How did he get his name, and is he one of your favorite characters? I had so many favorite characters in your book.
I do a little bit on nicknames. Where do these nicknames come from? The street names, and their uses. They preserve a certain anonymity. But I found that many kids were named after food. There were noodles and donuts and mackerel and their favorite food. It sort of, to me, it sort of emphasizes the importance of food and hunger in driving their trade. So they were also named after their origins, Chicago Joe and what have you, and often their disabilities, right? Leggy and limpy and things like that. So I do a little analysis of their nicknames and also race as well, and ethnicity, but it's a form of a kind of solidarity. It's a way of knowing people on being on friendly terms. Noodles used to fetch noodles for Boss Croker. He was I think a state senator, a politician in New York, and so he got his name because he was the runner who would fetch noodles for this famous politician.
So is there any truth to Newsies, the movie, Newsies, the musical? Can you sit through them, or do the
Yeah,
historical inaccuracies get
I
crazy?
sit through it. I saw my cousin acting in it in California a couple summers ago, and it's a good sort of kid power theme, and it is a strike, a 2-week strike, one of the longer ones against the two giant newspaper publishers, Hearst and Pulitzer, and of course they got the support of the other newspaper publishers, and they helped print their signs and what have you. Um, so it has some good qualities to it. The strike was not a grand triumph as it is in the movie, in the sense that they did not win their demand for lower wholesale price, but they did win the ability to give back unsold papers, which was an important demand, an important way to keep from taking a bath on slow days. So I think it's a good romp, great dancing, great energy, and it does show kids involved in a labor struggle.
And could you talk about the headlines, how they would choose which headline to cry for the day?
Yes. So their job was not just to sell the papers; it was to create the market for their papers, and they assumed a certain kind of expertise. And in the middle of the 19th century, the newspaper offices would put on the bulletin board the top story, and this is what you cry. But they would often read, and they would see, no, this piece of legislation is dead. That's not going to get anybody. But this crazy story about a two-headed calf or something like that, they would cry. They would also make up headlines. W.C. Fields was a famous the entertainer. He was a newsboy in Philadelphia, and he would make up stories. Amos Stump found in an eagle's nest, he'd say, and then the person would come back and say, "What's this story's not in the paper?" And he'd say, "Oh, you lucky sir, 1 in a million. Anyway." So it was kind of a routine. It was kind of a form of entertainment to kind of busking and trying to gather a crowd. And they would cry the stories that they thought were most fetching, and sometimes making up news, sometimes creating war between Russia and Japan before it happened, or the assassination of Andrew Johnson after the Civil War. So they were involved in some of these hoaxes, and threatened with arrest and prosecution in World War I for crying about the sinking of ships and what have you. So the newspapers themselves would publish untrue stories as well, but the boys would sometimes embellish and engage in that activity as well.
And they understood that what they were selling was heavily political, right? They understood that they were marketing the right wing or marketing the left wing point of view to some extent, right?
Well, you get the kick in the butt, from somebody, so you understand they didn't like what you were saying. And then I have occasions in some newspapers of people, boys also sold on trains, and they, one would say, "I won't sell any Republican newspapers," or there were the anti-Catholic newspapers in the 1920s, and the boy said, I'm not going to sell that." So they would pick and choose in some ways what paper they would sell. So they were aware of the editorial messages of these, not all of them, not all the time, but often enough that I have several examples of them, using their discretion about what to sell.
And can you talk a little bit about, for our Victoriana audience, their Civil War battlefield experiences? I thought that was mesmerizing in your book.
Yes, I have a whole chapter on the Civil War newsboys. They were one of the few characters who really cross back and forth between the home front and the battlefront. So they're doing big business at home. People want the news like never before, and the soldiers provide a real market. The Union Army, in particular, they have money to spend, and they're hungry for news about the battles they've just been in or about the politics in Washington. So this becomes quite, again, big business. And certain distribution companies are able to get monopolies, are able to serve in certain theaters of the war, and children are working for them, or they're prospecting on their own. And so some of these children will attach themselves to a unit and be the one designated to provide hundreds of newspapers to that particular unit. And some also young recruits who are soldiers. They get designated to provide the newspapers for the regiment. And so there's military people, there's civilians, and they're going back and forth. They're getting caught by the other side. It's a little different in the Confederacy. The Confederacy newspaper industry is devastated during the war. I think there's several hundred newspapers, and by the end of the war, there's maybe 20. I guess it's 80 to 20. And so they don't have paper, they don't have ink, and their soldiers don't have spending money. So it's quite different. But they also are recruited as spies to run messages back and forth. And so I have had a little presentation how newsboys won the Civil War, which was my way of sort of exaggerating their importance. But if you think about it, they are really integral to raising the morale of the soldiers. And in 1864, Lincoln is the first head of state who subjects himself to a political election in the course of a war. Unlike our current president, who thought about canceling this coming election, Lincoln, had the election, and he really won by the margin of the soldier vote. So we can think about the degree to which they would have been willing to vote to continue fighting, which they did without this constant infusion of news and information.
So the African American press often had African American newsboys disseminating for them?
Yes, it did. Most ethnic newspapers had children from their own ethnic group, but not exclusively, and they would recruit others as well. So yeah, I think was it Richard Latimer, the famous inventor? He actually distributed the Liberator. Garrison's Liberator, and so these children are often the sons of former slaves, and they go to work, and they're part of the abolition movement as well.
Can you tell the funny story about the mining town where they were so desperate for news? The isolated mining town where a greasy old paper got really valuable.
Well, yeah, I guess so. That is. I also have a chapter on the West, on the frontier West, because it is the urban frontier, it is the industrial frontier. These cities are going from 300 to 30,000 in 6 months. Boom towns like Denver, and because of these gold rushes, and so that was a story from the Yukon territory. And so again, these miners are hungry for news, and so these enterprising kids decide to take the papers from Seattle up to the gold fields, and there you can hike the prices. You can go from 25 cents to $1, and also you could charge people to go into a theater and pay a quarter to hear the newspaper read to them. So we get our news with the internet and all different ways now, but this 19th century Victorian way of face-to-face exchange and the buying and selling the papers and the newspaper as a physical object, that created a lot of work for people and a lot of interaction between people of different classes and worlds. Mm-hmm.
Oh, can you talk about Father Drumgoole and the and that archive that surfaced when you were starting your research?
Right, Father John Drumgoole. He is not very well known. There's a little park named after him in New York, but he's a Catholic priest, a poor Irish potato famine immigrant in early New York, 1840s New York, and he by hook and crook got himself to the seminary, got himself ordained, and he was like the sexton at the church. That's the church that had the plaque. And so he became a sexton, a janitor, caretaker to a priest. And his main mission was to take care of these street children, which were proliferating after the 1870s. And so he took over this St. Vincent's Newsboy home, and he becomes a sort of counterforce to Charles Loring Brace, who has the Protestant Children's Aid Society, which is shipping children out to the West and having newsboy lodging houses. And so, they're accusing this outfit of trying to convert Catholic boys. And so the Catholic Church wants to get into the business of catering to these children. And they don't want kids separated from their families, sent to the West without their parents' full approval. And so he launches what became one of the biggest child welfare institutions in the United States. And he would hold lotteries and raise money, and he had little pamphlets that the kids could sell. And he moved his operation to Staten Island, and it had thousands of children, and also one in Lower Manhattan. So this was not an era of a law, social safety net in terms of the public responsibility. But his outfit and Brace, they did get tax money to take care of these children sometimes. And so these church groups and other groups would provide these kinds of social welfare services.
Because these kids were quite vulnerable, right?
Sure. They are vulnerable. I do have an essay about the funerals. Not all of them made it, let alone did they become millionaires. They would die on the job and be buried in a potter's field. And in order to avoid that fate, some of their fellow newsboys would raise money and buy headstones and flowers and things like that for these children. So they were vulnerable to the weather, to the conditions, to poverty, to hunger. To suicide. I have cases of children dying by suicide. So it was a hard life. I have to. That's something we have to acknowledge as well.
But there's characters that you clearly fell in love with in the book, right? Because they had so much personality, and they controlled their own narrative in a weird way, right? So many newsboys got to tell their story.
Well, it's true. Sometimes when I read history, I think the 19th century was 27 different people, and but if we look beyond the movers and shakers and the political leaders, there are hundreds of people. And they have an intellectual life. They're writing letters to the editor. Johnny Morrow had his own memoir, his autobiography, sort of patterned off slave narratives, slave autobiographies. And so these voices are there if you dig for them and listen for them, and they give us an interesting perspective on these events in this period.
We have time for one more question. Who else has a question? Because if not, I have more questions. Right, they got people stole their stuff, right? People stole from them, someone's asked, right? They were vulnerable to theft too, right?
Well, they were vulnerable to theft. Sure, their whole stock of papers could be stolen from them, for one thing, and they were at times. That's why you needed brothers, you needed friends, you needed people to protect you. They would steal from each other, and they would protect each other. It was a very risky kind of enterprise. Trying to think of other cases of being. They also were thieves. They also, my father talks about when he was selling papers as a kid in Boston in the 30s. He said, I didn't know right from wrong. I saw something, nobody was looking, I took it. I didn't think about anything about moral, and so a lot of the kids have talked about that, and in terms of other sort of nefarious deeds that they would engage in. They had to live. And so they would mug people, they would steal, and they would uh, sometimes sell their bodies. So this is a boy prostitution is also an aspect of this story that comes out, and so this is part of the reality.
And so my last question is, so when you give talks on this, you must encounter people all the time who either were newsboys or had family members. Are people coming up to you at events and saying, thank you so much for telling this story and winning prizes for it?
I have gotten some letters which have been very nice from people. This is my story. This is my family story. I sold paper, my you know, and so I have gotten some wonderful sort of reaction like that. And then, you know, at a few of the talks that I gave, again, people would say, you know, yeah, you think it was tough. You don't know how tough it was, you know. And so people are they have their own stories about how they lived and how they had to put what they earned into their mother's apron in order to eat dinner that night. That was their reality.
Thank you so much. This is a great book. Could not recommend it more highly. It's absolutely fascinating. What a core piece of American intellectual life, right? And how we got where we are today in many ways,
Thank
right?
you all for coming.
Early clickbait.
Thank you for enjoying it so much. It's wonderful.
Really great. Thank you all. Thanks everyone for coming.
Right.
And absolutely fascinating. This is a great moderating job. Such a cool book.
Thank you, Eve.
Really an honor. And congratulations on all the prizes.
Thank you.
Well deserved. Thank you. Thanks. Good night, everyone. Bye.